Mama Watali presents Strong Women, Strong Men series. Today's topic on the raft of global violence against women and children, International Edition, featuring Margaret Nicholas, Executive Director, National Committee for Families and Children, Belize, Central America. Mefo Takambou, Cameroonian journalist and editor at Deutsche Welle International Broadcaster in Germany. Moderator, Rita Morbia, co-manager, co-gestionnaire, Inter Paris, Ottawa. Mama Watali is an Ottawa-based non-profit organization with an international reach.
Mama Watali means in the absence of a mother, and it comes from the Bantu language of Luganda. And it was born after my mom passed away. Now, the organization is really at the core to serve Black women that have suffered personal loss, whether it is through loss of a loved one, but most especially because of domestic or what is sometimes referred to as intimate partner violence. When women go through violence of any kind, women just need somewhere to turn and talk to somebody, either in search of resources or just somebody to listen and validate what they're going through as they try to recover and rebuild their lives.
Mama Watali was founded to support survivors of gender-based violence and to create awareness of the challenges women continue to face.
We are doing advocacy work at all levels of government, from municipal, provincial, to national level, because women's rights essentially are human rights. And at the core of the human rights is the equality of both men and women.
Founded by Susan Namulindwa, Mama Watali has successfully undertaken several projects nationally and internationally, including the creation of a library in Uganda.
When I was a little girl, I loved to read. I remember being in a boarding school and splitting novels with my friends so that we could read. So I used this opportunity of being in Ottawa to collect books from my children's school boards, and with the help of lottery and volunteers, we transported those books to Luero and set up a community library. We were able to distribute books to neighboring schools so that they could use them to elevate the education in the area. We have also done community microcredits for women in Luero still and in Uganda in general. And we also were able to get school fees for girls. These are girls that will be high achievers for secondary school who would not have gone to school otherwise. So those are some of the things we have done in the past. Right now, our target market is right here in Canada mostly. Black women, new immigrant women that have been affected by domestic violence, intimate partner violence, or any kind of loss. So we are setting up community support circles. So we are encouraging women to get in touch and find just some either professional help or women that have also gone through what you're going through to support you. Sometimes it's just a shoulder to lean on, or somebody to say, you know what, I've made it. If I made it, you can make it. So we are really trying not to talk about being victims. We are talking about overcoming.
The vision of Mama Watali is to give voice to the lives of Black women in all its dimensions.
Well, most of us have seen or witnessed a situation that we know is wrong. We know somebody who is going through some kind of abuse, some woman who needs intervention, but sometimes we don't know how to do it. So we want to put volunteer resources together so that people know how they can help in a way that is helpful for the family and helpful for the woman or the women that are going through it, so they can move forward with their children. We are putting together resources for parenting. How do you parent? How do we parent boys and girls to make sure that the boys know that they don't have to be abusive. This is not a power struggle, that they can have healthy relationships. We need to emphasize the fact that when a girl or a woman says no, that no means no. And there is no reason why, as a society or as a community, we should turn around and blame the victims after they have been abused. So currently we are holding a series of conversations. So these are weekly conversations around issues that affect women. I want to call strong men out there, strong women out there, but especially strong men. This work is not about women versus men. We need to hear the male voices. There is a lot of good, strong men out there that fight day and night for their families, that go out every day to protect their families. We need to hear your voices. We need to hear you add your voices to this work, because, the family is the core foundation of our community. So if we have broken families, we are going to have a broken community. So a family is the nucleus of the community. So if we build strong families, we will build a strong community. Jump in and let us do this work together.
Thank you so much for that video and that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm going to begin with today's program. My name is Rita Morbia, and I work for a feminist social justice organization called Inter Pares. I'm honored to be your moderator today. My organization, Inter Pares, we work with local activist groups in Canada and around the world on a range of different issues, including gender-based violence, the main topic of our conversation today. I'd like to now call on Talisa Singh McKay of Mama Watali to do the land acknowledgement.
We gather this afternoon on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge that they lived here before us and keep living here now. Reconnaître le terrain sur lequel nous vivons est une invitation pour nous à reconnaître l'histoire de la terre, des gens et de la connectivité pour donner un sens à ces connexions. By learning where we live, we now honor the cultures and practices of the people of this land and continue to be aware of and participate in the healing process of colonization and intergenerational trauma. As a woman born in this country to immigrant parents, myself and my family are guests. Je vous appelle à reconnaître que vous êtes également des invités et des gardiens aussi. As an organization that advocates for support of Black women and families who experience personal loss, all forms of intimate and gender violence and harassment through a historically patriarchal and racist system, we recognize the myriad hardships faced by Indigenous people. Nous reconnaissons comme des personnes de couleur également opprimées que les ancêtres des peuples autochtones ont été dépossédés, se sont fait arracher leurs enfants et leur culture a été dépouillée, que les esprits de votre peuple apportent la force d'avancer tout au long du chemin vers l'émancipation. May the spirits of your people bring forth the strength to move forward throughout the journey to emancipation. The patriarchal systems in place have damaged all of us, our families, friends, and our personal environments. Nous voyons à travers les yeux. Nous nous embrassons et nous agissons. Nous ne sommes pas des spectateurs. We are not bystanders. As we celebrate the UN Decade for people of African descent, let us remember our ancestors, those who were enslaved, the mothers and their children who were raped and sold into slavery. May their spirits give us strength to uplift our voices as we continue their journey to freedom and equity. Alors que nous célébrons la décennie des Nations Unies pour des personnes d'ascendance africaine, souvenons-nous de nos ancêtres, de ceux qui ont été réduits en esclavage, des mères et leurs enfants qui ont été violés et ont continué d'être vendus comme esclaves. Puis, leur esprit nous donnait la force d'élever nos voix alors que nous poursuivons leur chemin vers la liberté et équité. Thank you, et je vous remercie.
I want to extend a very warm welcome to our three incredibly accomplished panelists. And I'm going to begin with introductions, which will give you, just a sense of the breadth of their expertise. So first of all, we have Margaret Nicholas. Margaret is based in Belize, where I hear it's very warm. And she began her career over 30 years ago, working in the Social Development Department, now known as the Department of Human Services, in various capacities. She's had a distinguished career in the family court system, including being named to the post of magistrate. And here she cultivated a reputation of being a real champion for families and children. Currently, amongst her many commitments, she serves as co-chair Child Protection Technical Working Group to End Violence Against Children, and she's a member of the National Gender Violence Committee. So Margaret Nicholas has recently been appointed Commissioner of the Supreme Court in Belize. Her commitment to continue advocating for improved conditions and services for children, women, and their families remains high on her agenda as the Executive Director at the National Committee for Families and Children. Welcome, Margaret. We also have with us Mimi Mefo. Mimi is an award-winning Cameroonian journalist and currently working as an editor at Deutsche Welle, international broadcaster in Germany. Born in Cameroon, Mimi Mefo has been working as a print and broadcast journalist in her country for almost a decade. In 2018, she became the first ever woman editor-in-chief of the English service of the private media house Equinox TV and Radio. Her focus has been politics and gender issues. In September 2018, Mimi established her own news platform, Mimi Mefo Info, which has been the source of news for millions as a crackdown on media has intensified in Cameroon. As a result of her journalism, she has been surveilled, harassed, arrested, and imprisoned. She has won several prestigious awards for her courageous journalism, including a 2019 Freedom of Expression Award by Index on Censorship. Welcome, Mimi. And our third panelist is Ketty Nivyabandi. Ketty joined Amnesty International Canada English section as Secretary General in 2020. She is the primary spokesperson for the branch, is responsible for the development and delivery of the branch's human rights work, and shares senior leadership with the executive director of that organization. A global human rights activist and advocate, Ketty holds in-depth and lived expertise on refugee issues and the intersections of gender, race, democracy, and human rights. Prior to seeking asylum in Canada in 2015, she faced police violence as a leading organizer of women's peaceful protests for democratic change in her country, Burundi. In her previous roles, Ketty has led research and advocacy to support global women peace activists in several conflict and post-conflict countries, including as a journalist. So I want to start by learning more about you all. So I'm going to ask if you could tell us a little bit about your own journey. What motivated you to work on women's rights, to commit yourself to combating gender-based violence? And maybe, Margaret, we could start with you.
All right. Thank you so much. It is indeed an honor and pleasure to be a part of this esteemed panel. So thank you, Madam. For me, it really started, well, you said over 30 years, so it started some way, way back. But what really motivated me was, I always remember when a woman was hanged for killing her husband, and the husband was a police officer. We studied the case for a while, and we recognized that it was all circumstantial. It was in those days when we were still not an independent country. We were still a colony under British rule. And of course, her husband was a policeman, so he was a Queen's man. And so there was no mercy at all for Nora Parham. She was actually the only woman hanged for killing her husband. And so a group of us got together under the leadership of Derla Bowman And we started an organization called Women Against Violence. Because it was, that was so blatantly cold, the way that woman was hanged. You know, just remembering it brings chills to me. And so we started this organization called Women Against Violence. And through that organization, we started to lobby and advocate for Domestic Violence Act, for a family court, for anything that would help us to ensure that women were better taken care of after that incident, because we had so many of those kinds of cases. And so that was really and truly what drove me to this whole passion and this whole need for one to be a part of that process. And so it was Women Against Violence, it was BOWAND, and then it was the department, then it was working with youth groups, it was working with women's group, and continue to do that up to this day. Because although we, you know, I see domestic violence, gender-based violence, intimate partner violence, whatever we want to call it. To me, it's one of the world's pandemic, because we talk about COVID pandemic, but I think this is a pandemic that is at our heels for too long. And while we're at the point of finding a cure or a vaccine for COVID-19, we're still struggling with this problem of gender-based violence, domestic violence, intimate partner violence. And we're still struggling with people understanding the whole problem with this scourge. The fact that we still continue to blame the victims, the fact that we still ask women, what did you do? Why did this happen? You know, and that is still at the core of where we are here in Belize, and I think globally it is almost the same. So I am happy to note that this organization is having these conversations, because I think one of the conversations that really struck me was when you did the conversation on spirituality. And because we talk about patriarchy and how we live in a patriarchal society, we are swimming in a patriarchal sea. But I think that really brought home to me the whole spiritual socialization and how that itself impacts on how people see and look at domestic violence, and why people stay in relationships, and why socialization has really and truly put women in a serious condition and position. So that is how my journey began.
Thank you, Margaret. We can really hear the passion and commitment and dedication in your voice and in your journey. Ketty, would you like to talk a little bit about your journey next?
I agree with what you just said, Margaret. It's so great to hear you making it so clear that violence against women and patriarchy in general have been the pandemic for the longest time. My own journey, I think, began very personally. We always say that, you know, the personal is political. So I was raised by my mother, who got divorced when I was quite young. So she was single, and I was raised with a freedom and it was just me and my sister. So we didn't have a brother, and I didn't get to experience the different treatments that often exist within a family. So I grew up really feeling very free, but very, therefore, witnessing and being very shocked seeing what would happen in other families when I would go to visit my cousins or my friends. And I recall, for instance, very well that on the street that we lived on, there were at least 2 women who were regularly beaten by their husbands. And when it got to, sometimes it got really bad, that they would scream, and the entire street would hear them, and they would often sometimes come and find refuge at my mom's house, because she was the single woman there. It was a sense of refuge for them. And I just recall being absolutely shocked that, you know, such a treatment would happen, and the next day life would go on. You know, people would just dress up and go to work and do what they have to do. So I think I've always been really taken by a thirst for justice, And to me, violence against women is one of the most insidious and the most enduring forms of injustices in our world and globally. And so then later on growing up and finding that that reality is the same across the world, wherever we go, and finding the extent to which women have been diminished, have been violated, just further sparked in me an outrage, an absolute outrage at the situation, and a desire to do everything that I can and we can collectively to change that. So that's been my own journey.
Thank you, Ketty. That's it's both dark and inspiring. There's both those elements in your personal journey. Mimi, would you like to say a few words about this?
Yes, I also would want to assert or also accept that gender-based violence is like some sort of a pandemic that has been going on for too long. I come from Cameroon, like you said, but Cameroon is also one of the lone bilingual countries that we have in Africa at the moment. And I hear from the English and the French speaking parts of Cameroon. But from my father's area, when I was a kid, when it comes to education, the male child, it would come first when it comes to education. And for the women, you are groomed to become a wife. Education was not really something for the women. It was all about the men going to school and getting the best jobs. That's the notion that we had. And from the Northwest region where I grew up, actually, it was also very common to see men beating their wives, even in public. I also grew up thinking that such things were even normal. Any girl child or people would grow up in the same community having that notion that is just but normal to beat up a woman. So over time, I started seeing more and more cases, and the statistics were growing. This gender-based violence, I kept seeing it on a daily basis. And I realized that this was something that needed an urgent solution. So when we engaged in debates such as whether a woman actually has a place in the kitchen, it was not surprising to see proponents of such absurd position winning the debate, because it was almost becoming like a normal scenario in Cameroon at the time. But more generally, there was this feeling of vulnerability imposed on women at the time I was well, which I found difficult to explain, given that I was brought up by my grandmother and also my mother, two powerful women that I consider like they're these icons, these people that I look up to. They brought me up so nicely, and they did a wonderful job raising me as a woman. And I saw this example in them that women could do something. Women can be these powerful women, and they could also create impact with or without a man. So cases of gender-based violence were just a commonplace that would have just been normal to see. Also a boyfriend beating up the girlfriend, and it's just like some sort of pride or something. So any person with a conscience cannot afford to be silent about such issues. Challenging gender-based violence is almost synonymous to saying that this is my right to live, to me. And now I became a journalist, and I also realized that even in our newsrooms, we face that. There are certain topics that are reserved only for the male journalists. Politics are supposed to be done by the men. Women are just supposed to look at human interest stories or maybe gender-related issues, sports, and other topics that women should handle. So this discrimination is like a chain that continues. It's not something that ended at a time, but even in our newsrooms today, we keep seeing that. That's why it would be strange that you hear a woman is an editor-in-chief, a woman is head of a newsroom, a woman is leading a media house in Cameroon. So that's how it's always been. These are some of the things that I struggle hard to fight against. Everybody's supposed to be equal.
Thank you, Mimi. What I hear in common from the three of you really is that sense of outrage at the injustice that you've all witnessed, in different parts of your life. To understand a little bit more deeper about the specific country context in which both Margaret and Mimi find themselves. Maybe I can turn to you, Mimi, again, and you can tell us a little bit more about the general political and social context in Cameroon, and then, specifically about gender equality, women's rights, gender-based violence, how that manifests.
Gender equality is some sort of a difficult concept to fully articulate, especially in a country like Cameroon, where patriarchy runs very, very deep. You heard what I just said just a few seconds ago. You can just tell by the number of women in public offices today. We don't have any governor as a woman. We have very few ministers, female women as women leading private ministerial positions in Cameroon. Even among the political class, you are more likely to see women viciously attacked than their male counterparts, especially those who are holding these positions at the level of the parliament. You see them being attacked on a daily basis. And in terms of women's rights, any woman born in Cameroon is more likely than other women in other parts of the world to suffer some sort of female genital mutilation or even breast ironing. It's also a reality in Cameroon. The figures are not really, we don't get statistics constantly, but this is something that is existing in Cameroon. In addition to some of these issues, over the years, I've also watched in dismay at the fact that women disproportionately also suffer from all sorts of physical and sexual violence, whether in the school milieu or even at their places of work, in different walks of life. Even in the conflict that is plaguing the two English-speaking regions of Cameroon, we are seeing that those who are most affected, they are the women and the children, but women are more affected. So far, the data shows levels of educational attainment. So it shows that the levels of educational attainment might not really be a barrier to any woman being subjected to violence. But unfortunately, it prevails. We see women's rights being violated on a daily basis.
Margaret, I'm wondering if anything Mimi has said resonates in Belize as well in that context.
It surely did. It surely did. I felt that she was talking about Belize, except for the mutilation, because we don't practice that, no? But in terms of the discrimination, the fact that when we talk about the national government, we have even regressed because we just recently had elections and now we have only one woman in parliament, because first we had three. Now we only have one. And really and truly, I mean, it's a man's world, really and truly. And women in Belize are making their strides very slowly. But as Mimi rightfully said, they're the ones who are first to be attacked. They have to work 2 times harder than a man, or do the work that the man doesn't even do for the pay that he gets and the recognition that he may get. I have seen recently a kind of move to kind of liberate women in certain positions that they never held before, like they're now chief executive officers and so on, and I think that is good. But they're still under the purview of some man, some gentleman up there is their superior. But at least it's a little step up. But I mean, oftentimes what she has described is pretty much what we are seeing in Belize. And so we know that these things are global issues that we're faced with. And I don't know, I realize that it's a lot of work, but the work cannot stop. We can't throw up our hands. We can't go into despair. We just have to try and see how we can continue the movement and move in a direction to which we want to really and truly go. But it's very much the same.
Thank you, Margaret. Ketty, as someone who understands the international context, and you've been listening to Mimi and Margaret, you understand the global trends. What are you hearing about these specific contexts that resonate more broadly with respect to women's rights and gender-based violence internationally?
I think it really is. I don't even think it is a global phenomenon and a global pandemic, as we said earlier. I mean, patriarchy is global. It's absolutely, it manifests sometimes differently, but the overall core belief is that, and the core reality is that for a very, very long time and until today, women continue to be subjected to violence. They continue to be silenced. They continue to be excluded, to be marginalized from decision-making places and circles of power. They suffer that violence on their bodies. And simply have, you know, what we're seeing globally is the denial for women to be fully who they are and to be fully themselves and to own themselves. So we see that across the globe, whether it's in a variety of measures on the African continent, for instance. I'll tell you, in my home country, for instance, women to this day do not have the right to inherit. That right just doesn't exist yet. And even when although we've had CEDAW and we've had a number of policies and set in place for the protection of women's rights. The reality often is that those who enforce those rights are largely men and tend to be socialized to continue to exclude women. So what we find is that even when those laws exist and women come forward, they still aren't believed or are not supported. And continue to experience now a double violence. So the violence from the person who inflicted on them, and then the violence of a system that they go to try and find remedy. And that has just been made worse now in the current context that we're in COVID right now. So there are levels of violence, whether it is in Saudi Arabia, where today Loujain Al-Khatul has been released for calling for so long for the women's rights to simply drive themselves in Saudi Arabia, to the ironing that's been done in various countries, including in India and elsewhere, to the female genital mutilation, for instance, to wife beating, and to exclusion from decision making. It's absolutely global, and requires us to do much more than enact laws. I think we do have to put in place a legal infrastructure, but that's not enough. There's deep societal work that has to be done, and to undo really the chains of patriarchy globally.
Thanks, Ketty, for putting that into context. I want to pick up on the issue of the COVID-19 pandemic. So even before COVID-19, I mean, the UN had declared violence against women a global pandemic in 2015, 2016. I mean, 1 in 3 women worldwide experience physical or sexual violence, mostly by an intimate partner. I mean, violence against women and girls is a human rights violation, but it's one that it seems very few people in the world were paying attention to. And COVID has in some contexts served to expose and exacerbate inequalities. But because of COVID-19, health services around the world are strained. Resources that would have addressed violence against women have been diverted. So maybe, we can talk a little bit about the specific contexts related to COVID-19, and maybe I'll turn it back to you, Ketty. How has that global pandemic impacted the other existing global pandemic on violence against women? What are the intersections of gender-based violence and COVID?
COVID-19 has not just highlighted, but it's really brought a shocking rise. This is what we're seeing in gender-based violence against women and girls around the world. What happened is the lockdown measures that were put in place simply just transformed homes into cages of violence against some women and some girls. Actually, this week, Amnesty just released a report which analyzes the intersection of gender-based violence, the pandemic responses that were put forward, and then the social cultural practices which are barriers to justice. And the report is really focused on Southern Africa, on 5 countries, but it makes it really visible how much the government institutions and policy decisions are entangled with patriarchy and the patriarchal social order, and how much women and girls have been trapped with little chances of escape. So it really shows very well that lockdown measures meant that women just could no longer escape abusive partners. They could no longer leave their home to seek protection. The declaration, for instance, of health emergency measures just meant that gender-based violence counseling centers could no longer take care of survivors and support them. And we're also seeing that these gender stereotypes that have always been embedded in social and cultural norms just fueled the violence even more. So I'll give you, for instance, an example. In the first week of the lockdown, the South African police services reported receiving about 2,300 calls for help related to gender-based violence. And that number just simply increased dramatically a year later. And so what we're finding is that also for the women and girls who dare to report this violence, they're simply just not taken seriously by authorities, but they're also turned away simply because of the lockdown measures that are in place. Some of them have even tried to access health services, but would be told that because gender-based violence injuries are not COVID related, then those are not emergencies, and they would be turned away, simply turned away. So it has not only made the violence explode, and it's also made it impossible for them to seek the very little avenues for help that existed before.
Thank you for painting that broad picture for us. Margaret, I'm going to turn to you and ask you how some of the things that Ketty was saying internationally, how they manifest in Belize specifically. You know, what's the situation with respect to COVID-19 and how has this affected gender-based violence?
Well, she has just described us, really. We went up about 26% of the cases that we had. We had about 1,900 calls for help. And I think there was an attempt to try and do some virtual, make some virtual responses and counseling, but it didn't work. Because as she rightfully said, the lockdown was an imprisonment for women and children. Because both women and children were caught up in these lockdown situation. And as she properly described it, there was not much help from the health authorities. COVID was a novel thing. People were afraid. Even the health authorities were afraid, the way that I looked at it. And so if you were not having a high temperature or you were not running your nose or something like that, you would have been turned away from the health services as well. So what she has described is exactly what we have been seeing here as well, in terms of the numbers of persons who are locked in and the number of people who are not getting any help. And as she rightfully said, and that is the thing that really irks me a lot, because the services and the service providers are really and truly the perpetrators. And so as she rightfully said, it's a double jeopardy. You know, they're violated by their partners, and then they're violated by the system. Because even before COVID, if especially with the police, it's a joke. And it is this kind of thing that in a minute or two, you'll be back together. Don't worry about anything. You know, you're going to get back together. This has resulted in us losing 155 women who were killed because of the same kind of situation, as well as 19 children. Because we lost 155 women to domestic violence. They were killed either by their partner that they were living with or by an ex-partner who found somewhere to get them out and then end up killing them, or women were so afraid that they let them into their homes and then they ended up dead. You know, and it is just so sad the way how these things continue to play out, and how the police, the health authorities sometimes even the family services, women's department, and some of their players within the system, and even sometimes the intake officers, you know, once you go there more than once, it's a joke. People don't understand that a lot of people stay in domestic violence situations because of need, because of economic need and that kind of thing, not because they necessarily want to stay. A lot of times people stay because they really want to end the violence, but they don't want to end the relationship. So the services are there to help people, to help them, to support them, to understand all of these things, rather than just to further perpetrate violence and injustice against them. So it's pretty much the same that she has described that we have seen through this pandemic situation.
It strikes me that the scale of the issue of gender-based violence is really staggering. Mimi, I'm wondering if this is something that you've been seeing as well in Cameroon.
Yes, of course. I like the fact that Ketty and Margaret looked at the situation globally and also in the southern parts of Africa. But let me take the situation of Cameroon, neighboring Cameroon, in Nigeria, in countries like Ghana, and possibly Zimbabwe, which is still in southern parts of Africa. These are countries whose medical systems were really epileptic pre-COVID, before the COVID-19. So it was difficult for women already, even before the coronavirus pandemic, to have access to proper medical care. And with COVID in place, it's even very, very complicated. Now, like I said, in Cameroon, for instance, it's not just facing COVID-19, but it's also facing one of the worst political crises in decades. Which is the Anglophone crisis in the northwest and the southwest regions of Cameroon. We also have the Boko Haram crisis, and we also have a crisis in the eastern part of the country from the Central African Republic. Now, so far, we have 31,000 coronavirus cases. Nearly 500 people have died from this pandemic. And how it's affecting women is the fact that before March 2020, when the first cases of the coronavirus pandemic were reported, women were facing there were so many cases of the rate of maternal mortality in Cameroon was already a very big problem. And it's not surprising that no matter what efforts have been made so far, women are more likely to suffer with the coronavirus pandemic in place. When the government, the authorities in Cameroon said that there should be lockdown measures in place, like Ketty and Margaret said, my thought was on these women. My prayers were, I was thinking about these women who only rely on earnings from market sales to feed their families, their children, and send their children to school. They were either being beaten, others could not, they were not able to take care of their families, they could not go to the market, and some of their husbands are not going to understand this situation. They would not be able to provide for their family, and it was very, very difficult for them because there was no policy in place to take care of these women. So besides being locked down at home, some of these women could go out, but they are faced with this repression from security forces. They cannot do anything to take care of their families. So simple things like lockdown can become a source of gender-based violence as women are forced to stay at home as well, like we said earlier. And now another big problem is discussions on gender-based violence have dropped drastically. People are no longer talking about it. Even though we have statistics being published on a daily basis, we don't have discussions on gender-based violence like before. We now talk about COVID-19 and on general terms, how it's affecting the society, how it's affecting men and women, but not how it is causing gender-based violence. This is something that we should start talking about. We have to start pushing forward this debate, looking at how, because of COVID-19, there are more and more abuses against women. I think that's going to help.
You know, what all of you said has really illustrated the continuum of violence and the interconnections, you know, related to women's human rights. So violation of the right to health intersects with personal safety. economic well-being has an impact on physical and emotional security. It's really, really vivid in the types of examples that you are all talking about. I mean, in Canada here, there have been a number of high-profile cases of violence against women, including a shocking mass shooting last year in Nova Scotia that many understand to be rooted in misogyny and a perceived lack of power on the part of a male shooter. I'm wondering if the specific, I mean, Mimi, you've said it's no longer part of the national conversation, but some of these high profile examples, and I know there have been some in the specific countries we're talking about, you know, have they caught the public's attention, you know, and, you know, is gender-based violence as a result on the national political agenda anywhere? I mean, maybe we'll start with you, Mimi, and move on to Margaret.
Yeah, in Cameroon, we don't have related gender-based violence as far as COVID-19 is concerned. We really don't have statistics, and it's highly underreported. That's the first problem. But with regards to the conflict in the northwest and the southwest regions of Cameroon, I said earlier how women are the most affected. We see women being tortured, we see women being murdered, we see women being slaughtered just because they have a thing or two to do with state or non-state actors. We've seen that on a daily basis. In the far north region, most of them are being used as suicide bombers. And if I have to go back to the northwest region, we have cases of prison warders, we have cases of women who sit in their homes and their houses are burned by security forces or even the armed separatist fighters who are fighting for the independence of the northwest and the southwest regions of Cameroon. So they do not only perpetrate this violence against women. These acts are being filmed and sent out there to the public for people to see. And then goes this debate online, people saying no to violence against women, and it lasts just for weeks or just few days, and then life goes on. Nobody talks about it. There's no concrete measures that are being put in place to protect women. Perpetrators could be arrested, and it just ends there. There's nothing being put in place to make sure that some of these things do not happen again. That's why I feel like those who are in the position of authority in Cameroon, for instance, I just realized that because most of these people easily just get away with what they do, and the debates just end at the level of maybe social media campaigns and maybe local media campaigns. Like people go to traditional media and they criticize, they condemn. I think that there's some sort of a conspiracy on the part of the authorities in Cameroon when it comes to gender-based violence, because there's nothing that's been done to stop that from happening.
Margaret, do you want to elaborate on the context of Belize?
The National Gender-Based Violence Committee in Belize, the National Women's Commission, has really taken notice of the pandemic situation and the gender-based violence crisis. And some of the things that we have done, we have actually developed a complaint mechanism. We have put complaint boxes throughout the country of Belize, within the police stations, the post office, and so on, so people can actually put their complaints in there without having to go to service providers. What we have also done, we have also created a domestic violence pathway, because what that does is to give direction as to where do you go, who can you call. And we have this as a PSA on our local radio stations or local TV stations, so that people are able to see it and are able to access it where there is access. Because of course, way down in the southern parts of Belize, there might not be a television access and internet access, but invariably it's almost all over the country. So those are some of the things that we have been doing to try to see how we can still get people to report. We have been constantly trying to sensitize the police, the police, because we have domestic violence unit in every district in our country. There's a 24-hour the domestic violence unit that is open. There is a hotline that people can also access. And one of the reasons why we set up the complaint mechanism and why we are trying our best now to ensure that we have gender focal points in each ministry of the government's departments, so that when these complaints are lodged, that people could be held accountable, because I think that is the problem. People are not being held accountable for what they're not doing in terms of their own work that they're being paid for, because it's a job. Like within the police department or within the Ministry of Women Affairs, whatever, they are paid to do this as a job. And so we believe that mechanism has to be tightened with some kind of monitoring and evaluation piece to it as well. So now we are working on the indicators to see how we could put that into the pipeline, so that there is monitoring and evaluation, and there's some kind of, because like Mimi rightfully said, or having legislation is far from enough, because legislation, so there are legislations, who enforces them? Are they really enforced? Because the enforcement to me is more the problem than the actual the behavior itself. Because if you are not punished for your behavior, when you punish a woman, when you beat a child, and you can just walk away when there's a breach, and so you're sent to prison, or not even sent to prison, but given a fine, and that you don't even pay unless you're caught doing something else. So those are some of the things that we are trying to do, because apart from that, then the status quo would have remained the same in terms of people not knowing what to do and where to go.
Thanks, Margaret. I'm glad you brought up the issue of accountability, because if we pivot a bit to the international, I'm going to ask Ketty here. We have international, regional, human rights instruments that are supposed to be part of fostering, promoting accountability. You mentioned CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. There are things like the Maputo Protocol, which is more regional. Are these international instruments, accountability tools, are they effective?
I think that's what we've been trying to address all along, as we were talking throughout, both Margaret, Mimi, and I. These mechanisms are extremely important, and those who came before us worked really hard to get us to have them. But it's one thing to have, to have that mechanism, and it's another to change the practice and to address the practice of how that's done. So very often, unfortunately, the woman continues to face the same, the same beliefs, societal beliefs, whether she goes to court, what judge she's going to face. If this is a male judge, or a male who's been, socialized to believe a certain way, it's going to make it so much harder for her to do that. When she reports her violence to the police person is not trained, does not understand, has not had that work done, then what we're seeing across the globe, and particularly in this recent report that we've just put out, is that women are just not believed when they file these stories, or when they do. I'll give you the case of one woman, for instance, in Zimbabwe, Bianca, who since 2017 has been reporting the abuse of a partner, and he gets arrested and then he gets released. He's released shortly after, and so she's caught in this cycle of constantly reporting, and him constantly being released, and then even fighting and fighting the police themselves, being ridiculed really by her community, and even by the police station itself. So there is deep work that needs to continue to be done in the enforcement mechanisms that do make sure, that in order for those laws to be really upheld. And that's the deep work. That's the cultural work. That's the social work, that is done largely by feminist movements across the world, and particularly, on the African continent. Now, the challenge, right, coming back to this COVID context, is that those movements that do that deep work, first of all, tend to have very little resources to do so. And secondly, in this context, are not considered as essential services. So many of them don't even have the freedom to move. That's the other thing that we realize in this, in this briefing. Even though women come forward with, with the violence that they've experienced, these services that are there to support them are not considered as absolutely essential. They don't have the freedom of movement. They don't have the resources that they need, simply because gender-based violence has not been prioritized in the national policies to respond to the pandemic. It has simply become an afterthought. And so there's really deep work that needs to be done at all levels. And we certainly cannot rest thinking that there are laws in place that will protect women. No, because as I just mentioned, those laws are implemented by individuals who've been socialized a certain way. So there's still a lot of work, and as a result of that, women continue to be trapped in so much violence. And I know we've made reference to women throughout, but this is only far worse for LGBTQI individuals, for instance, for whom the stigma and the marginalization is unspeakable and is not even comparable. So there's a big gap between the legal framework and the practice, and that's true across the board. And that really ought to be where I think efforts are really focused.
Yeah, and from what you're saying too, I mean, one of the things that strikes me is that you need to name an issue. You need to see an issue before you can address it. And that brings me to the issue of statistics and metrics and data collection, which seems very technical, but is actually quite political. And Mimi, you spoke about this a little bit beforehand, and maybe so now I'll turn to Margaret to talk about, what is the situation in Belize related to data collection on, and statistics that are collected on gender-based violence. How well do they reflect the problem? How much effort goes into this in terms of government resources? How important is it?
That's a good question. We have a surveillance system through the health department. It's a system where all domestic violence cases are supposed to be reported, and that is supposed to go up into the national system. That is not working too very well, I can say right offhand. The other area that we use for data collection is the SIMS, which is through the police department. And that statistic shows us quite a bit more of the complaints where women complain just for the point of making it known that something is happening, but they do not want any action. And then, of course, the other area that we would get statistics from is from the court itself. And that might be the most reliable data collection agency for domestic violence, because that is where the cases are, which reaches the court. That is where the cases are dealt with and the orders are handed out. But in terms of the breaches, in terms of how well these things are managed, it is still a big question. So the National Women's Commission and the Gender-Based Violence Committee is right now working on a data platform, a dashboard that will be called Data for All. And we are hoping to work with the national system that we have in Belize, which is known as SIB. And we are hoping to work with that system to see how we would be able to get as much statistics as we can as a body, because we need the data to be able to even inform policies and different kinds of practices to the national government, because we do have a national gender policy which sets out all the, and it is aligned to all the different conventions that we have spoke about in terms of CEDAW and Sustainable Development Goals and all of these things. But these things are things on paper. But When we want to do advocacy and we want to make the point, we need to have the data, and we need to have administrative data. We need to be able to really and truly aggregate these data down to the nitty-gritty, so that we can be able to get the resources. We're trying to set up a center, because we have 2 shelters in Belize, 2 shelters for battered women, but it's only 2. And the 2 shelters, one is in Belize and one is in one of the other districts. So if you're living in any districts outside of that, you don't have anywhere to go. You have to come to Belize. Sometimes through the department, they may give you a hotel for the night, but next day, where do you go? You got to go home. So data is really and truly an important part of this whole spectrum. And that is why we need the monitoring and evaluation mechanisms in every which area of gender-based violence, in every area of work that we do. So tomorrow, as a matter of fact, we will be meeting with SIB to see how we could get this platform set it up, so we don't have to depend on the police, so we don't have to depend on the Ministry of Health. Because if those are the places that we're going to be depending on, then we're going to still be in trouble. So that is one of the ways that we are hoping that we'll be able to capture the proper data, and to be able to use data then to develop policies and other legislative reforms and other things that we need to tackle. Because even on the whole issue, as was mentioned a while ago, when it comes to LGBTQI, they are not even included at all in legislation. They're you know, and so they have been advocating, and they have been raising their voices to say, well, we are living, and this is the life that we have chosen to live. We have over 100 children living in these relationships, and we need to be able to, when we are violated, we need to be able to access the services that are available, but we cannot, because it is not set up for us. So we are hoping that through this mechanism, we'll be able to move it, but for right now, that is what we have.
Yeah, I'm really hearing the need for data in order to be able to advocate as well.
Because remember, you can say, I can say, I have 1,000 cases. So show me the 1,000 cases. Who are these 1,000 people that are affected? You know, people want to see evidence. People, especially if you are working with a group of people who don't see this as a priority, then you have to make it become a priority. And so you have to be able to give data. You have to be able to give raw data and say, see, here it is. This is what I have. These are who are going through this. These children are punishing. These children have lost their mothers, and they're no, you know, that kind of thing. So data is essential to anything that we do.
I see Mimi nodding, so I want to turn it over to her. But before I do that, I just want to remind folks that in about 5 or 10 minutes, we're going to see if we can answer some questions from the folks, from you folks out there who are listening. So please, I urge you, if you do have questions, to put them in the Q&A box. Go ahead, Mimi.
Well, when Margaret was talking, I'm so happy to hear that, but I wish it was the same kind of mobilization or measures being taken in Cameroon. In Cameroon, for instance, there exists data on gender-based violence, but the data are largely inferior and not a representation of what is happening across the country. And this is because of so many reasons that I want to mention just a few. For instance, the Ministry of Women's Empowerment and the Family. This is the lone ministry. We also have the Ministry of Women Social Affairs. But social affairs means that it cuts across whether men or women's social affairs, but Women's Empowerment and the Family is the lone ministry out of the tens of ministries existing in Cameroon. This is the lone ministry fighting against gender-based violence. It also has other issues to fight for or take care of. Unfortunately, this ministry has, for over the years, it's having the lowest budget annually. So just this year alone, for the year 2021, Marie-Therese Abena-Ondwa, who is the minister in charge of this ministerial department, she was defending a 7.8 billion francs budget, which is one of the lowest budgets in Cameroon. I mean, when I'm talking about in terms of all the ministries that are existing in the country, it has the lowest budget. Just like Margaret was saying, this makes it very, very difficult to collect the right data. And even if you want to collect the data, it's only limited to rural areas, to urban areas. If you want to go to interior localities where there are no roads, access there is very, very difficult. How do you go there when you don't have the means? So it becomes very difficult to get to these enclaved areas, these areas where roads are very, very bad, to collect data and take the right information. And when you don't have this information, when you don't have the data, how do you get how do you get the budget to take care of all these cases of gender-based violence? And also because we have this constant dominance. Men are constantly dominating the women. The women feel like, if I get to report my husband, I mean, a lady who is in an interior locality, who is not in an urban area, would say, if I get to report my husband, I lose my marriage. So what does she choose? She doesn't have anybody who is going to guide her. She has nobody to tell her, look, these are your rights. These are the things you are entitled to. These are the advantages of you not being a woman who is abused. She would prefer to stay in the marriage than get into trouble because there's nobody to see her through, guide her, give her the necessary advice, and take her out of that situation. We also have non-governmental organizations that are existing, like activists, gender promoters, but they are also limited in these urban areas. They are not in the interior localities. So generally, it's about data. It's about getting the right information. So when there's no information, when the information is not getting to the right headquarters, it's very, very difficult to trace it back to the victims, the real victims of this gender-based violence.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, Mimi. And, this is in a context where we know globally that gender-based violence is underreported to begin with. It's notoriously underreported to begin with because of the stigma. I want to turn to Ketty and follow up on something you said earlier related to feminist organizations, women's rights organizations, and I would say even government bodies addressing gender-based violence, that they aren't given the resources to do their work. I wonder if, Ketty, you want to elaborate a little bit on not just the challenges, but also, despite these challenges, some of the progress that's being made globally.
Well, first and foremost, all the information that we have currently is thanks to the work of these movements, these feminist movements and these feminist organizations that have done this despite all the challenges and the hurdles over the years. We're building over the work that other women have done before us and have done so in incredibly impossible circumstances. So we would not have access to the information that we have if it weren't for these movements and for these individuals and these organizations. I think that's really critical to bring forward. I say this even from a human rights organization's perspective, in the sense that in the work that we do in every country, we work with local partners, right? We work with local human rights organizations, and we know for a fact that women will report the violence that they've experienced to someone that they trust, to an organization, an entity, a fellow support system that they have trust in, and that tends to be those movements, those organizations that have been there and that have done that work and that understand the situation in which these women are. So I want to say that our work overall is built on the efforts of these largely women-led organizations or LGBTQI organizations. That's really fundamental. And now what's really devastating to see is that these services, as I mentioned earlier, right now in this pandemic, are not considered as essential and are not given the room to function and are not given the resources to do that. That adds to the tragedy and to the lack of information that we then receive. The information gap that you're referring to is a direct result to the lack of access that these movements and organizations have had. Nonetheless, women are pursuing it and are continuing to do that work, but really, as I said, at really high risks. I wanted also to come back to something that Mimi had mentioned earlier, which is sometimes we forget in the narratives that we build around these crises that people don't choose crises that they face. So women who are facing domestic violence, for instance, right now, are doing it in a context of a pandemic, in a context of a really fragile economies, sometimes in a context of conflict. And so this moment that we're in is just exacerbating those realities even more. Think of women who are refugees, for instance, right now, and who are experiencing that violence in the midst of this pandemic, who don't have access to these basic services that are usually there to support them, and then so therefore are left on their own. And so that's a huge challenge that we have to face and we have to address. And that's why I go back to the absolute necessity to have policies that are informed by the women and the actors who are working on these issues directly. The response mechanisms that we've had to the pandemic have often excluded the perspective of feminist movements, for instance, do not include resources for those movements right now. It's actually seen almost as a non-essential reality. And yet that has a direct impact on women globally. So it's really important to bring those perspectives together. And then I just wanted again to go back to the fact that we can't also look at gender-based violence in silos. We cannot look at it on its own without understanding the realities that are that are around them. So, for instance, if we're looking at Canada, and you're looking at a Black woman who's experiencing violence, gender-based violence in Canada, the likelihood of her reporting that incident to a police that she feels that she doesn't believe can protect her, that she believes discriminates against her brother, her son, is very low. And so we cannot therefore think of gender-based violence without thinking about what we're doing about discrimination in public services, in the police, in the healthcare system. She's not going to report that if she doesn't feel trust in those institutions. So it really is critical to have a really holistic approach and solutions to these. And again, this is the perspective that is brought by feminist movements, and that's why they're so vital and so critical at this time.
Thank you, Ketty. And to that end, we do have a question from one of our attendees that I want to put to you. She says, thank you for all of you for sharing your experiences and the critical work that you're engaged in. And the question she has is, do you think that the data collection is part of the systemic patriarchal violence that we're seeing? In other words, is the request for data another structural barrier? And if so, can there be other approaches to get funding for programs for women? There's a lot to chew on in that question. A lot of connections to be made. Margaret, do you want to comment?
I guess that I could say yes. It could be, since we know who is in charge. But I believe that the way speaking for Belize and the way we are attacking it, we're attacking it from the gender-based committee process, because we realize that if we only depend on the national system or the police or the health services, that we are not going to get there. So what we are doing outside of that, we are actually resourcing, we're mobilizing funds. Because I recognize that, like what was said earlier, a lot of us don't have the resources, so we need to be able to mobilize funds. And right now we have the Spotlight Initiative in Belize. And through the Spotlight Initiative, we're able to get funding to do quite a bit of work. So we're using the Spotlight Initiative, we're using UNFPA, we're using UNICEF, and we're using all of these organizations to be able to try and meet our demands as far as setting up the database and the dashboard to be able to collect data. Because definitely it is not as was said earlier, it is not seen as an essential. It is not one of, maybe doesn't even have the political will, if I could dare say so. So I feel that it is necessary that we continue our push and our advocacy and our lobbying so that we could get a seat at the table and then eventually get them to understand how necessary this is. And if we can get through our strong women organizations and these different organizations to join with us and to go with us to Belmopan, to Capital City, to the National Assembly, I think that is going to be our way of moving this process so that we eventually get the dashboard and the platforms that we need to be able to collect data, to be able to inform the policies, and to be able to do some of the work that we know need to be done. So, but yes, that could be one of the barriers indeed.
I know, Margaret, you've talked a number of times throughout this presentation about some of the progress, some of the initiatives that you folks have put forward in Belize. I wonder, Ketty, internationally, or Mimi, with respect to Cameroon, if you have something to, if you want to talk a little bit about the quote unquote progress, or, you know, some of the initiatives that are actually making a difference, you know, or even in general, if you wanted to enact, you know, a few, you know, one or two, of course, there's a lot of changes needed, but if there were a few areas to concentrate on, you know, what might those be? Maybe Mimi, you'd like to go first?
Well, I will start with existing feminist organizations that are in Cameroon. We have a good number of them. Like I said earlier, most of them are concentrated in the urban areas, but they are doing a marvelous job. They expose some of these cases of violence, abuses against women, and they fight for women to be involved in decision-making circles in the society. In Cameroon, for instance, they've been organizing seminars, debates to talk about some of these issues, especially when in Africa, when the Sex for Grades debate was going on, we saw most of these organizations, NGOs, and even associations coming together to talk about the need for this, not just to enter the university milieu or in the school premises, but they were taking now the debate to the newsrooms, to into companies, and making sure that there are measures being put in place. There are guidelines and protocols being put in place to protect women in their respective jobs. So more and more women are also being encouraged to be counselors, parliamentarians, and even senators. Initially, that was not the case. They would just, the various politicians and political parties would just present their lists and they would go for the election. But now the condition is it should be 50-50 in Cameroon at the moment. So it's like some sort of an obligation, not like that. But when it becomes something like it's some sort of an obligation, it gives me the impression that it's not really genuine. So I want to feel that women deserve to have this. They deserve it because they are capable of doing it. I don't want women to become parliamentarians or councillors just because they want balance at all levels. But let me be able to see it even when the president of Cameroon, for instance, the president of Ghana, the president of Nigeria is appointing the ministers in the country. Let me see the 50-50%, the 50-50 ratio to represented at that level. And some of these non-governmental organizations and NGOs have also been involved in fighting gender-based violence, such as early marriages, like what we see in the far north region of Cameroon. They have been talking about it. It's something that's been going on for so long now, because we see the level of literacy there is very, very low. And female genital mutilation, like I talked about it earlier, and breast ironing, there's been a lot of campaign against some of these practices. But without adequate data and reporting, especially at the level of the media, because even the media is absent in some of these areas where we see most of these women's rights being violated. The media is not present. These organizations cannot go there, possibly because they don't have the means, the financial resources to go there. It is still very, very difficult.
Thank you, Mimi. Ketty, I'm going to turn it over to you, but we have about 5 minutes left before we have to wrap up. So I'm going to let each of the panelists maybe speak once again. And yeah, starting with you, Ketty, what needs to happen? What needs to happen?
Very concretely, some of the things that we are recommending is, as I mentioned, first and foremost, ensuring that gender-based violence is absolutely a priority in how states across the world are responding to pandemics. But to go into more specifics, things like economic recovery packages, for instance, that are being created really need to take into account the gender pay gap, but also the gender dimension and the losses that women and girls, have been faced, and LGBTQI people have been facing. We need to be able to, provide capacity building for, in order to have really gender-sensitive responses to the service providers in these emergency times. At the police force, defense forces, social workers, the justice system. And all that, but also more practical things. Like, for instance, we're seeing many states being really good at how they manage the pandemic through technology, using technology-based solutions like SMS, phone and online tools. But these don't include the gender-based violence aspect to them. And integrating them and making it easier for women who are currently locked into that violence to report those mechanisms through technology-based solutions would be already part of the solution. So there are different really tangible ways that we can do, for instance, ensuring that women and children who are fleeing abuse in these moments, during curfews, are not further penalized for doing that. Sometimes there are things that are as simple as that are happening right now in the midst of a pandemic. And then we're seeing a lot of public communication from states around the pandemic, around prevention. That's an opportunity for states, again, to communicate the risks of gender-based violence, and to commit to public education on these things. So again, using the tools that states are using to respond to the pandemic and adapting them to gender-based violence, treating it as much as a priority and an emergency as the COVID-19 pandemic, I think would already go a long way.
Thank you, Ketty. Margaret?
Well, one of the things that we really want to see in the very, very near future, we want to reinstitute the Batterers Intervention Program, because we believe that men need to have a place to go. They need to be able to be rehabilitated. They need to have a place where they can be reformed. And so we had a Batterers Intervention Program, and a number of men were a part of the process, a part of the program, and some of them did change behaviors. But that program kind of, it went quiet. And so we are trying to work at that as well. Because I believe that if we have men in the center of the conversations, and if we have them in rehabilitation, if they are mandatorily ordered to go into rehabilitation, instead of going to prison as one of the options, some kind of alternative, so that at the end of the day, they get some kind of a sense of where they are. Because we also believe that the whole issue of violence is a part of people's socialization. Sometimes it's a cycle, because what children see, they practice. And so we believe that while we work very, very hard and close for our women, we also need to incorporate our men, and we also need to ensure that our men, that their behaviors are reformed and that they are rehabilitated, so that they can go back. Because most of the times, some of these women want the men back in their homes, they want them back in their lives, But I think that if they don't walk through some kind of a process, some kind of training and sensitization, then I don't think that that is how they're supposed to go back home, or the partner should go back to them. So it's one of the things that I would really want to see manifest itself again, a Batter's intervention program for perpetrators.
Thank you, Margaret. And lastly, Mimi.
I would always want to go back to Cameroon, but what prevails in Cameroon, we should always know that is not very different from other African countries. In Cameroon, for instance, there are laws that if these laws are respected, gender-based violence would be minimized throughout the national territory. Some of these laws also exist in neighboring countries like in Nigeria, in Ghana, in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, but most of these laws are not being respected. So if I had the power to effect change, to enact some of these laws, I'll do a few things. I will possibly start by placing harsher sentences for people involved in any form of violence against women. Surely just say that it's terrorism against women and it should be treated as such. That becomes serious. That's what I'm going to do. Secondly, I'll also put in place effective violence prevention and collection of a collective response that will be able to track and deal with some of these cases of gender-based violence and uphold the rights of women. Because earlier we talked about collection of data and lack of resources. Because all of these things are not there, it becomes difficult. And thirdly, I'll end the conflict that's going on in the northwest and the southwest regions of Cameroon. This is a conflict, it's an armed conflict now. It was just a crisis, now it's an armed conflict. Others call it genocide, others call it a humanitarian crisis. But in the midst of this crisis, there's COVID-19. In the midst of this crisis, there is gender-based violence, and women are the ones suffering, bearing the brunt of this conflict on a daily basis. So if there was a way for this conflict to end, I think that is going to reduce the rate of gender-based violence. Those are some of the things that I have as proposals.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a lot of work to do. And as Ketty indicated earlier, deep work to do. I apologize to the last few questions in the Q&A, which we will not be able to get to, but I want to thank our three incredible speakers, Margaret Nicholas, Ketty Nivyabandi, and Mimi Mefo. Thank you so much. You've given us such a vivid picture of what's at stake and how we can address it, that this is not inevitable, that gender-based violence can be addressed. So thank you. And thank you to Mama Watali for hosting us. Join us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. There's a YouTube channel, LinkedIn. So we have all of those available. Mama Watali's contact information is there. The email is info@mamawatali.org, or there's a snail mail number, PO Box 53124, Rideau Center, Ottawa. And a special thanks to the funders, the Government of Canada through Employment and Social Development, Canada funding administered by the Red Cross. And thank you for all of you who attended tonight. It was fantastic to have you, and it was much appreciated. And together we hope that we can address this pandemic of gender-based violence. Thank you.